It was about 100 years ago that this young woman was failing, that's right, failing, her second proficiency test for the China Inland Mission. She was about 18 years old, had a fourth grade education, and worked in a very blue-collar, low-end family just north of London. By this time, after two fails and a life that had really no educational hope for anything better, her parents had resigned her to become an indentured servant, was the best place for her in the rest of her life. Thank God that she had an internal clock within inside of her that understood the mission of God. I have this chair in front of me here today because she was known as the small woman. In fact, if she stood on this chair, she and I would be looking about eye to eye. She was about 4'9". They say 4'10", but that was in high heels. After failing that test for the second time, she spent an entire year saving what would be the equivalent to us in America as nickels and dimes, and eating only about every 2 to 3 days enough money for a single woman in 1920 to get on the Trans-Siberian Railway and travel all the way from, and remember, this was a Bolshevik revolution that was happening in Russia, to get on that train and go all the way across almost 6,000 miles to inner China. She was not sponsored by anybody other than a woman had heard of her plight. They had a mutual friend, and she said, "Would you come and help me with an orphanage?" And so Gladys Allward got on that train through impossible situations, impossible odds, limited resources, a little or no education, and by herself in a man's world 100 years ago, traversed through the dangerous areas that she would have to go through and get to a foreign land. She didn't know a lick of Cantonese or Mandarin, and she found herself in an orphanage taking care of hundreds and hundreds of children. As the communists swept across China later, just a few years later, as the Japanese invaded China and was ravaging its countrysides on the other end, she found herself this small little woman, yet with a great vision and faith for God, in the middle of circumstances that you and I could probably never fathom in our life. But she overcame them with great courage, great desire, because she understood in the very core, in the center, the mission and purpose and plan for God and for her life. While she was 4'9" or so in the English-speaking world, that would have been very small and diminutive. But in China, she could see everybody eye to eye, and she was perfect for the Chinese children and for the Chinese culture. As the war intensified, there was one point in her own diary where she says, "I saw what the communist Chinese were doing to these young villagers, ones that had just become Christians. I had to come to Jesus, to myself, to know that I did not have the faith that they did, the things that they had to go through, the things I had to witness. I asked myself to God, what could I do in that one moment? Would I have the courage and the bravery?" She said, "On that day, I realized it wasn't a college degree. It wasn't a prestigious job. It was the dependency of being able to drop on one's knee and trust God in that moment of what God had called them to do. And if doing in that, God would meet me in an amazing way." If you know anything about the story of Gladys Allward, you know that she had to take hundreds of children and march them through almost 50 miles of jungle under attack from both communists and the ravaging Japanese. She was injured and wounded, but yet was able to keep many, if not all of her children together. She got to a swollen river, as it were, and had no way to cross it, being pinned in on both sides. They all dropped her to their knees in that one moment and said, "God, we need deliverance. We need source life. You've called me all this way across the earth to fulfill this great plan and purpose. You're not going to leave me stranded here by this riverbank to perish with all these children." History tells us that within an hour, an empty freighter comes floating down the river, had been ravaged by a war, but lands on the shoreline right in front of them. She's able to ferry them across the river, wounded herself. Gladys' story, her story lives in infamy. In 1957, Alan Burgess writes this little book called The Small Woman. And this little insignificant small woman that lived 30 years before, now every major Hollywood star, every studio, every actress wanted to play the most courageous woman that they had ever heard. Gladys Allward's inspirational story of being on mission, of never giving up, of knowing that the very most important quality of our life is when we get into situations greater than ourselves, kind of like the one we're in now. The greatest quality that you and I can ever have is to drop to our knees and say, God, what have you called me to be? What have you called me to do? What purpose and plan do you have for my life? Oh, you can't not have faith by listening to the story of Gladys Allward. She had a little inn. They call it the inn of the 8th happiness. The movie calls it the 6th happiness. But that happiness was one more than the Chinese life, the Chinese culture had written as optimal. And that 6th happiness was that the greatest happiness you could have was in finding purpose in Jesus and letting him take that purpose in your life. We thank you for not only watching, absorbing, but being inspired and being faithful to give. Your continual giving and faithfulness has not only kept the doors open on this church, but in the video that you saw with Pastor Kenny and his CSUN mission students and the other things that you see us doing on a weekly basis are able to have us make an impact during a very difficult time every single week in the life of this church. We thank you for all those that continually give faithfully, those that use our website, those that still send in checks, and for those that use our PushPay. And simply that PushPay, you just text in 77977. And in the memo, you just write EN City Church. And when you hit that send, it'll take you right to the prompt. And it'll give you instructions on how to give. God bless you, church. I encourage you to go rent the movie, The End of the 6th Happiness, or buy a copy of Alan Burgess's book, The Small Woman. It will literally change your life. Listen to this message over and over again and be inspired. These aren't made-up figures. These are real-life heroes of the Christian faith, ones that sustain us in very difficult times of trouble. God bless you today.